Well, welcome everyone. It is 9:32. We've added a couple more in the last couple of minutes, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Let's first start off by introducing ourselves. I'm Jason Bedgood here with the ETV program. I'm the program coordinator for us. In the room we have...
This is David Myers, public service faculty here at the Fanning Institute, and we are the third-party administrators for ETV.
And I'm Lori Tiller. I'm working here at Fanning as well on the evaluation part of this.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, guys, we're thankful to have you. And again, this is very much an information situation. We're going to provide an overview of ETV. We're going to provide some information about how funds get distributed throughout the state and what our office is doing around those funds. And so, David, do you want to start us off by giving us a quick overview of the program and how it's came to Fanning?
Sure. So we became about 2 years ago, we've entered into some conversations with the Department of Family and Children's Services to become the third-party administrator for the ETV program in Georgia. The division looked to us to become the administrator based on some previous work. Some of you may have heard of the Embark network, and we'll talk a little bit more about Embark towards the end of the webinar here. But the ETV program is the Education and Training Voucher Program. It pays for educational expenses for young people who have experienced foster care. And so one big reason that the division approached us to become the administrator for the program is that over the years that Georgia has been paying for educational expenses for young people in care, but we don't really have a good sense about the number of young people who are progressing through to graduation. And so, in other words, what kind of bang for the buck are we getting for these dollars? And so there was an evaluation component, and I think Lori can say a few things about that later on in the session, what we're doing to try to understand sort of the state of affairs for young people who have experienced foster care in terms of education, and then how is the funds that are distributed through ETV impacting that progression. So that's kind of the big picture, and then it made sense with us being a university partner. A lot of the work that we do, and I think Jason will talk about sort of the day-to-day nuts and bolts of ETV, and a lot of our interaction is with other university and technical college system partners. And so it just made some sense for us to become that third-party administrator. We're excited about it, having the opportunity to partner with both folks like you who are on the call, on the webinar today, and those other universities and technical college system schools, and some private schools for that matter, to try and help students who have been in foster care achieve their post-secondary educational interest, whether that's a certificate program and a 2-year program or a 4-year school, and that positions them to go on and be successful after that educational experience. So in a broad stroke, you can see on the screen, ETV will provide financial support for students who have been in foster care. We're going to talk about the criteria in a little bit, but while attending a post-secondary educational institution. And I've alluded to this, but there's a broad definition of what a post-secondary, from certificate to university 4-year program. So let's roll into it. I think we can talk about some of the details now.
Well, recognizing we have various members of our audience here and looking at various situations, maybe you're working with youth, maybe you're on the other side of it and you're working at the college level, or maybe in the State Department somewhere. We want to give you an idea of how we, as part of our trainings and working with youth, we want to give you an idea of what that looks like. But first and foremost, in order to make payments to different situations, the colleges that we send students to, the institutions we send students to, have to be accredited. And in case you're one of those folks that are looking into sending students off to college or to post-secondary institutions, if you're interested in determining if a school is or is not accredited, there's a website link here, and we'll actually email this out to all of our participants at the end of this presentation, so you can have this PowerPoint to go over later. But if you're interested in that link, you'll be able to click on it, and through that link, you can type in the school or the state, and it can filter through different schools in that state. And in this case, we picked Abraham Baldwin here, and you can see that Abraham Baldwin has been accredited, in this case, since 1953. One other note I would love to make here is as you're looking through this and making sure your school is accredited, and again, in order for ETV funds to pay for that student or support your student, the school has to be accredited. But notice down here at the bottom where it says accredited in nursing. Many students will find that that they're wanting to do one thing or another, and we find that some students end up at a school that doesn't do what they want to do, but they go to that school for various reasons, whether it's location or cost, but it may not have the programs they want. So we would encourage you to look at this website and find situations that have accredited program for whatever it is the student may desire to do as they get older.
And one thing, this is David, what I'm intended to bring up when we first started, and we just got into it, is that this is the same webinar that we use and present to young people. So we were just at the Teens Are For Me conference, which happened at the end of last week. So on Thursday of that, we presented the same content to adults like y'all who are on the webinar. And then on Friday, I presented the same information to young people. And so our goal is to try and talk about sort of the nuts and bolts of ETV. We'll talk about that process, but also we want you to see the information that we're sharing with young people, so that as questions pop up or you're having interaction with prospective students, you know the information that's being shared with them.
Absolutely. So that's what accredited looks like. Most schools are accredited. There are over 700 schools in the state of Georgia that are accredited. So just because it's accredited doesn't mean it's the best school for that student. So we continue to encourage students to make best decisions based on their situations, but use this as a resource as you need it. Continuing to think about some of the schools we work with, here are a few of the most popular ones that we've worked with over the last year. We have many students over at Dalton State and Kennesaw State, and even Valdosta. We see a lot of students from just a handful of different areas that are going to a handful of different schools. So if you're kind of interested to know about more schools, we can talk about that later. You can contact us and we can talk about schools that may be in your area that are not listed throughout this. We also like to make it very clear, while oftentimes we say college in place of post-secondary institutions, we do pay for other places besides just college. We pay for tech schools and trade schools as well. We just made a payment here recently to an electrical apprenticeship program in Atlanta. They were accredited, and we were able to support one of our students going there that'll be in that program for about 2 years. And so we were very, very excited to be able to help that young person work towards their dream of being an electrician.
So let's move to the next slide. And I want to ask you guys before we move through this slide, just if you went to college or continued your education past high school, I want you just to think for a second to yourself about what were some of the factors that influenced your decision about where you went to school. And if you're in a position to type that on just a quick response in the chat box or as a question, I'd love to see what some of the things popped up for y'all as factors.
While we're waiting, why did you go to school? Where you went?
So I went to school at James Madison University, which is, I grew up in Athens. I went to school at James Madison, and there were two primary factors. One was that I needed to get out of town. I needed to go to see somewhere different, and then I also had a list of criteria, including school size. About 10,000 students is what I wanted. East Coast, because my family was sprinkled up and down on the East Coast. I wanted more girls than guys, if we're being honest. And then there were a couple other things. Major, of course, was not one of those things, because I started as a business major, then was a Spanish major, and then eventually became a social work major. But here's some of the responses that were popping up amongst that y'all have responded. So major, so what were the courses of study, location, cost and location, living on campus or an on-campus lifestyle perhaps, parents. So family is one that that has a huge influence on where folks go to school, and then folks are ready to leave home, and sometimes that can mean going just a few miles away, and other times it can mean going a long way away. So here's opportunities available at the college, like cost, location, reputation. So these are the as you see as we move to the next screen here, the very same things that y'all are considering are the same things that we're encouraging students to consider. What's the size of the school? Where is it located? Degrees offered, cost of attendance, and of course there's other factors as well. But one of the things we know about young people who have experienced foster care is that oftentimes there's a layer of decision making that gets put on top of some of these, and so it's up to us as adult supporters to try and figure out how to support that student to make the best decision. Is a really large school like UGA the best fit for a student who may have never lived independently on their own, or would a smaller school be better? Oftentimes, as we're talking to young people and they're considering where to go, location plays a big role. It may be hard for a young person who has younger brothers and sisters in one part of the state to move to a far corner of the state. And then, of course, cost of attendance is a huge one. So these are the factors that we're encouraging students to consider, and of course, it's the same thing the rest of us considered as we went to school.
So again, different factors go into what a student's going to use to consider where they go to school at. And there again, we have another link here with a great website that provides a ton of details for different colleges. And we wanted to point you here. This is College Navigator from the National Center of Educational Statistics, and they have some very up-to-date information. In the top here, you'll see a name of school and a place to type it in, and in this case, we use Kennesaw State as an example. They have a ton of information. Maybe students are interested in having athletic teams there. Maybe they're interested in making sure it's a secure place, or what's their graduation rates. There's a ton of stuff to think about. But from our perspective in our office, we deal with a lot of the finances of students going to school. And so we want to make sure that in our trainings and in our work with young people that students are aware of the cost. And there's a wonderful button down here that says tuition and fees and estimated student expenses. And as you click on that, you'll find some information about tuition and living expenses for the most recent school year available. And in this case, it was 2015-16. And notice that there at Kennesaw, if you were an in-state student, which most of our students are, you're looking at about $6,000 to go to school. Start adding to that all the cost of living expenses, and in this case, you've got room and board, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, room is, of course, where you're living, but your board is your meals, so that would include your meal plan. That's about $11,500. And then there are some other expenses. There are things that students are going to do outside of room and board that are going to cost money that we all use to live. And around that area, you're looking at about $6,700. Finally, it calculates it down here at the bottom for us to be about $25,000 to live and to go to school at Kennesaw State for 1 year. And to many of our students, that number is going to seem very significant and maybe even daunting to the point that school might not feel like an option for them. And so we want to make sure we're clear on how much it costs, and that there are no surprises for all of our students. But we also want to make sure they recognize there's opportunity through different resources, including ETV. Go ahead.
And one of the things that we just want to, we're a small group today. We're about 15 or 20 on the webinar. So as you guys may have questions or something like that, you can either use the raise your hand function or just type in a chat message, and we can pause at any point to go a little deeper in that conversation.
In order to provide just a little more information, here are a handful of our schools around our state and their different costs. Again, going back just one slide before, notice this is the cost for an entire year of living and operating, not just tuition, but the entire cost. So entire cost for Emory in this case is looking about $60,000 a year. If you wanted to be at Georgia State, you're looking at about 23, and then Georgia Tech about 22. Emory is obviously a very expensive school. Georgia State and Georgia Tech are a little less expensive. If you get into the more rural areas of Georgia, you'll find that the tuition and cost of living definitely go down. Some of you have probably either attended these schools or had friends or family that have attended these schools and experienced these things as well. The areas, of course, very different, and many students may want to be in a bigger city, but have students prepared, please, to know those costs.
I'm going to just talk for a second about the Teens Are For Me conference that was on Friday. We were able to present in front of about, I'd say, 50 or 60 young people who are currently in foster care, and I would say a good half to 2/3 of them indicated that they were wanting to consider going to school. So before we got to these slides, I asked them, what did they think it would cost to go for a year at Emory? And the answers were everywhere between $1,500 a year and $150,000 a year. And so I think, that's one thing. And when I asked the same question about one of the Kennesaw, but not Kennesaw State, but some of the other schools, the range was just as broad. And most of the young people were not thinking about what it costs to not only just go to school, but live on campus, and you got to have a place to eat, and those kind of factors. And then I was laughing to myself on the way home because I have a high school senior myself, and I went home and I began to ask him some of those same questions. And we've talked a little bit about it, but I think sometimes we may think that, I'll speak for myself, I start to think about a group of students who have been in foster care may have a lot less information or be thinking about this in a different way. But what I'm reminded all the time when I talk with my high school senior that it's hard for any 17 or 18-year-old student to really consider all the different factors that go in. The responses that I got at home were not altogether that different than the ones that I got at the Teens Are For Me conference.
Another place we want to point students that may be interested in schools that are a little more expensive, considering right here, Savannah College of Art and Design is nearly $50,000, and going back to our Atlanta schools, we're looking at a higher cost. One thing we want to throw out there is the opportunity to go to a smaller school and save some funding for that first year or two. And that might not be something that every student needs, but some students may need it. I needed it for a year before I could move off to the University of Georgia. Our family just could not afford that the first year, and so I had to work pretty hard that first year to save up some money. We all have those stories, and so we would encourage students to use those first couple years, if they can, to go to a smaller school that may be less expensive. But before we let them go do that, though, we also want to make sure that if they're wanting to go to Emory and become a lawyer or a businessman or woman, that we want to make sure those credits transfer. And so we highly encourage you to call these smaller schools, call the larger schools, and make sure that if they're doing that, they're making sure credits transfer and information goes from one place to the other. Make a plan and plot those pieces out early on. One other slide we love to throw at our students and make sure they're aware of are those annual increases in salary that you're going to get for every degree that you get. This top line up here with the yellow or gold bars are your annual earnings based on the different degrees you have. And of course, these are averages, but there are some big jumps here. Just graduating from high school, there's a nice jump. And then just graduating with a 4-year degree from college, there's a nice jump there. So we love to point to those figures and make sure students are aware of the importance of getting that degree for financial security in their futures and their families. On the bottom here, you notice the green bars are unemployment rates. So many of our students may experience this at some point in their life, and we just want them to recognize that most often the more education you have, the more likely you are to not experience unemployment, and just pointing those arrows in the right direction.
In other words, more education is a good insurance plan for always being employable. It's not rocket science, right? I think we all probably would intuitively guess that, but the figures tell the story.
And so again, we pulled you can see where we pulled our stats from down here, Bureau of Labor Statistics. Feel free to kind of use these with your students and make sure we're all guiding them in the same direction. So we point to all these figures and talk about how expensive it is and how important it is, and we kind of build up this image of making sure that students are aware of that college is expensive and it may be tough, but we don't want to leave them without hope. And in this case, the hope is Comes in the form of grants and scholarships, work study programs, and different aid. The Pell Grant in itself that all of our students should be eligible for is going to be in the range of
$5,800, give or take.
somewhere right around there, depending on how much it moves every year. Before we jump into ETV and all that, we do want to highlight loans, just because as we talk to students, we experience more and more that students aren't truly understanding what loans are. And some students believe that if I don't graduate, I don't have to pay it back, or that it's paid back at the same rate that I took it out at. And so we want to make sure we're communicating that loans, there are interest rates involved in that, and that no matter what happens, if they take out that loan and use that money, they're going to have to pay that money back. So please communicate with your students and continue to stress the importance of understanding loans before those are taken out. For those of your students that may be getting ready to apply, they may be in high school and getting ready to apply for the FAFSA, here's some information on that, a link at the bottom of our page. We encourage students to apply as soon as possible. Now FAFSA is currently opening October 1 for the following year. So in this case, FAFSA opportunities to apply will open October 1st here in just a few weeks, and that's for next fall. So students that are able, we would encourage them to get started on that application. Even though they may not have all the information they need, they can save that application status and continue to come back and fill that in. So please make sure you're encouraging students to fill that out. I want to pause for just 1 second. I'm seeing a hand over here from Salima Morrow. Salima, if you have a question, if you'll just type that into us over here, we'll definitely respond to that as soon as we see that. You may have just been raising it from way while ago when we were checking to see who was all here. Looking further into that FAFSA information, this is what that website link looks like that we listed down there at the bottom. If you go in as you're filling these things out, we want to make sure that students are clicking on the right information. And as we continue to walk through, there's a little box down here and it may get lost, so make sure it doesn't for your students. That if your student was in foster care or was a dependent or ward of the court since turning age 13, they need to check that box. This is really, really important. Here's where Pell happens. We scroll down further, notice there's the box that I checked, and then I click submit down here at the bottom. Again, check the box, click submit, and it's going to give me what I'm expected to have for Pell. That was last year's figure was $5,775. That would be split into 2 separate semesters. So divide that number in half, and that's what they would get for the fall and the spring. They may also be eligible for some federal work study. And then finally, here's a number we want to highlight down here at the bottom is that loan number. Students will see this number on their FAFSA, or they will get this number from their school that they are eligible for up to $9,500 in student loans. Please encourage your guys to be very careful about this number. Just clicking that number and saying, I'm going to accept that loan, they're going to send you that money. They're going to send the college that money, and that's going to be applied to their account. Whatever is left over will go back into that student's pocket. But then there's this outstanding loan bill, and that interest is going to begin to accrue over the years. They do not have to accept all of this $9,500. Students can select less than that. So if a student decides based on their budget they need an extra couple $100s for the year, they can go in and change that number and only accept a portion of that loan amount. They do not have to select the entire thing. So please make sure your students are aware of that.
And a key thing here is that we want students, especially a student who's completing this before they go to school, it's one thing, and it's a good strategy, I would suggest, to be conservative, right? But as a student gets into school, developing a good relationship with the financial aid office and their financial aid officer, those loans can happen down the road. It doesn't have to happen right at the beginning. And so having a good relationship with that financial aid officer is crucial. So if there's a need at some point, they can help figure out what the best strategy is to address it.
So finally, let's get to the ETV stuff. This is what you've all come to kind of figure out. So let's talk about that. There are 3 separate funding pools that we use to provide students funds, and it is kind of a mixed cocktail of how this works, but in order to kind of get your mind wrapped around, the ins and outs of it, we want to make sure we provide as clear of information as we can. So again, stop us if you have questions. We realize there's a lot to this. The first funding pool out of the three, we just call it Funding Pool A. The state number for that is 584. But these are for students who have graduated high school and received either a diploma or a GED. We have plenty of students who have received a GED, but up until they get 21. So again, not 21, but until they get 21. When they hit 21, they jump into another pool. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But for your 17, 18, 19, and 20-year-old students, we could even potentially have a student that's younger than that. If for any reason you have a student who's well ahead of the game and they graduate high school early, our policies allow us to pay for and help those students or support those students financially. Many of our students are presently in foster care as they have not aged out yet. But if they do age out, they age out after the age of 10, we can support those students as well. Notice the 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth bullet down here. This is a big one. This catches a couple of our students, so we want to be very careful about this bullet. Entered kinship guardianship after the age of 16. So if your student enters kinship guardianship before the age of 16, they are ineligible for this funding pool. So if a student is 15 years old, enters back into care with an aunt or an uncle, or returns home to their original family, they then become ineligible. They have to return to kinship guardianship after the age of 16 to be eligible for ETV Pool A funding. If the student was adopted after the age of 14, that's okay. And then if they met the 6 months criteria after the age of 14. The 6 months criteria there at the bottom only means that they were in foster care for at least 6 months, again, after the age of 14. That does not have to be continuous. They could have entered for 2 months at a time and then left and then came back to care for 4 months, and that's a total of 6 months. But they have to have met that 6 months criteria. Based on the adoption information there, I just want to highlight we get a lot of calls from students who are adopted at 1 or 2. And this funding pool is not for students who are adopted before the age of 14. For our next eligibility pool, Pool B there, 583, this is a continuum of Pool A. So notice Pool A goes up until you hit 21. Once you hit 21, you jump into this pool, Pool B. Notice the last pool down there at the very bottom, we listed it for $7,500 per year. This pool is now $5,000 per year. In order to be eligible for Pool B, the student must have been eligible for Pool A, so they must have been receiving support through that first eligibility pool. And they must be showing academic progress towards their degree or certificate program, whatever that may be. If for whatever reason they're not showing progress and there's a big gap in their education, they will be discontinued funding and ineligible for Pool B. This goes all the way up to and not including age 26. So for whatever reason a student is showing good academic progress, but just taking time to get through their schooling, then they could receive eligible funding up until the age of 26. Again, that's $5,000. Lastly is Pool C. Pools A and B were both state pools, and they are applied to state schools. This pool applies to state schools as well as out-of-state schools. So if you have a student who's interested in going out of state, this is the only pool they are going to be eligible for. In this case, again, youth have completed high school. They end up in college or post-secondary school of some nature. That includes students ages up to but not including 23 years old. Again, that's up to and not including 23 years old. Notice that we have a couple different nuances here. One being that the youth who left foster care after age 18, I think that was also in the first one. Notice down here at the bottom, though, again, they have to continue to maintain academic progress towards their degree. And again, this goes out of state, and that's $5,000 per year.
So let's skip to the next slide, and this is sort of a summation of the previous three pools. And so in total, the funds that we're dispersing, it's kind of it's a combination of a few different federal funding streams, which is why there are so many criteria tied to each of those different pools. This is a summary based on age. What you see are the eligibility amounts, and then there's a couple of caveats. One is that it is based on state and federal funds available every year, and so we are entering into contracts with the division each year, and so those states, or rather those funds are available on a year-to-year basis. The funds are available provided that we don't have too many until they're gone, I guess. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, is that if we were to have 500 students who are participating, we would have to make decisions about how the funds were to get distributed. Up to now, we haven't faced that issue. So, and then finally, if there's ever questions about eligibility, if you have a particular situation with a student, you can talk with us, or you can talk with the independent living specialist for that young person, and we can put our heads together to make sure that that we're making the best decision about as it relates to eligibility.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about real quick what types of things we pay for. So those are how we pay, or the qualifications to get students support. But when it comes to the type of things we pay for, it's pretty much the whole wide spectrum of things you can imagine for college and post-secondary expenses. Of course, tuition, room and board, but also books and supplies. We even supply rent reimbursements for students who may be leasing or at a house or an apartment complex. We will, again, that is a reimbursement. So whereas if a student's living on campus, we can pay up front and we can pay for those fees, and a student doesn't have to. But towards the as far as the apartment or house rental goes, the student will have to pay that first, and then we will reimburse the student with a check, and we'll get that mailed to them through their ILS. Monthly stipend card listed there in about the middle of the page, that's a prepaid debit card, and so students will actually get a debit card with funds on those every month, and we'll reload those as students are eligible for those in case they need extra spending money. That's about $150 a month. It could be $75 a month depending on the type of eligibility each student is experiencing. Finally, down here at the bottom, you notice we can pay for tutoring or testing. We can even pay for computers and technology if students need those as they relate to their educational expenses. We recently paid for a student, had their driver's license done, and it was, I think, $32 to get a student that license, and we were able to have the student pay for it. We reimbursed them so that didn't keep the student from doing other things they needed to do. We have a question here of how does a student pull down these funds? Can you provide more explanation? What do you mean by pull down these funds?
Dr. Red, we're going to be getting into sort of the process here in just a second. If I'm interpreting your question, how do they access the dollars in order to take advantage of ETV? Key number one is to be involved with, have a relationship with their independent living specialist. Jason's throwing up the ETV process right now, which looks complicated, but it is, at least in our eyes, not quite as complicated as it may appear on the screen. I think Jason's going to walk through here and some of the items that we need in order to both process the information and the payments, but then also help to understand the progress that we're making as a whole in our state. So why don't we walk through here, and then let's see if we get to your question, okay?
So first, as you can imagine, students before they graduate high school need to apply to college. And even applying for their FAFSA, they need to do that before they, graduate from high school. They need to apply to college before they graduate from high school. They need to apply for the FAFSA before they graduate from high school. And once they graduate from high school, receive their GED, hopefully having gotten accepted already and having filled out that FAFSA information, they need to begin working with their college or institution to determine what it's going to cost. I know that's a big thing for many of our students. That's a tough thing to do, is to make that phone call and say, hey, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what college is like, but I need to start figuring out what it's going to cost. And they need to have that conversation with their local college or technical school. They also need to be in consistent contact with their ILS. And in case there are folks out there that may not be familiar, your ILS is your independent living specialist, and each of these students have one if they're in the independent living program. They're divided into 14 regions across our state, and each region encompasses a handful of different counties. And we can definitely direct students to their correct ILS if students are not sure. They need to be working with their ILS to make sure that they're getting their ILS, all the information that's listed here on this big middle box, including their application for ETV funding, as well as their student agreement, which says they'll do a handful of different things, and make sure they get all that information in. We need their high school diploma or GED. We need their FAFSA information, as well as their school information, their class schedule showing that they're enrolled, they've been accepted, and now they have a schedule. As the school works out the financial aid situations, it may take a few weeks once the semester starts for everything to be applied, whether that's HOPE or Pell or any other aid. And once that all is sorted out, they will then send us a bill for the remaining funds, and ETV will be able to cover those things. But that can't happen if students aren't talking with their schools and letting them know that they are covered through ETV and making sure they're contacting their ILS to make that happen.
And so just to, again, to point out, it looks like a lot, and it is. Most of that is so that we can make sure that we stay in compliance with those federal regulations and guidelines. Some of that, though, serves a dual purpose for our evaluation goals.
Yeah. So notice that after we get all that information and we got it all in and checked off that the student is enrolled and ready to go, we can begin paying for that tuition or that housing or those book fees. We can also send them that card. They'll have funds on to use as a debit card, and then finally that reimbursement check we can use as well. Student finishes that semester, they send us grades, and they complete a survey. Lori, do you want to speak at all to that survey information?
Sure, I can. I think we have a slide coming up in a few with that. So the survey information, it's very brief. It's less than 25 questions, and it kind of asks, the students different questions about demographics, different questions about their experience with ETV, and it's both so we can check ourselves to make sure what we're doing and how we're processing is helping them, but it's also to get feedback from them about what maybe some of the different needs are that they're having, and what they're actually utilizing those funds for.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lori. So once they submit that all that information, we check it off that they are good and in good standing. They begin to submit that bill for the second semester, and the process continues to go round and round as long as they're in school and still eligible. A couple other notes we want to make sure we make here are that students are only eligible for one degree or certificate. We oftentimes have students who went off to a tech school or a trade school and spent 1 year there, and they received some sort of certification or diploma, and then all of a sudden they become ineligible for any further ETV funding. So if they want to go back to school, they're going to have to do that with different support than ETV. So we want to make sure that if a student has a plan to receive multiple degrees, that they do their best to receive those degrees at the same time. Our policies limit us to 1 degree or certificate for students, so please make sure your students are aware that once they receive that first degree or certificate, they will no longer be eligible for ETV.
And it's crucial to point out that as we're suggesting to students that they might consider a smaller school to go knock out some of those core classes in a smaller kind of environment, that if they go and pursue an associate's degree, that's going to create some issues later on for finishing their degree. So just it's about strategy, and it's about figuring out how to make sure that they're getting what they need and maintaining the most eligibility to take advantage of the funds.
And it's, declining an associate's degree is an option for many of these students. I declined an associate's degree. I was offered an associate's degree through a small school, East Georgia College, and I just simply declined. Not at the time, I wasn't receiving ETV funding, but it was an option to decline. So students can simply decline that and even come back and get it later as they need to. It can be picked up at a later date, and so that's an option as well.
But making sure to know the implications of that decision.
Yep. And then lastly, down here, our last note is we are a last dollar. So I mentioned this just a minute ago, but be aware that Pell pays before we do and Hope pays before we do. And if a student is completely covered through Hope and Pell and they have all the support they need, then a student will not receive extra funds from us. We are meant to be applied to cover costs that haven't been covered. And if Pell and Hope and other scholarships cover all those costs, students will not receive a refund check from ETV. They do receive a refund check from Pell and from Hope. Those checks come in the form through the financial aid office in the form of a check, and students can deposit those into their accounts. They will not be able to do that through ETV. The only checks they'll get from ETV are either reimbursements or they'll get money applied to their stipend cards if they're eligible for those funds.
Let's go to the next slide. There's a question from Ms. White. It says, if a youth attends school and drops out but then wants to go back again, will ETV assist them in going back? And I think this slide begins to get at some of that.
So thinking back to our eligibility, a student has to show continued academic progress. And one of those pieces of academic progress that we look at is this bottom sentence down here on this slide. So if you hit 21 and you haven't been enrolled in school for the 6 months prior to that, you will not continue to receive funding. That does not show academic progress based on our policies. So we highly encourage, if students have dropped out at, say, 18, we want to make sure those students are getting back into school at the age of 20 and not staying out too long. We often have had students call that are 22, 23 years old and say, hey, I'm in their age range. Can I get ETV funding? And we're so sorry we're not able to support you because you were not in school 6 months prior to turning 21 and you haven't been in school since. And so the policy and the heart of the policy is that students are continuing their education after high school and not creating big gap years in the midst of that.
You see, this particular policy or rule is sort of an artifact of those federal guidelines that we're having to follow. But I think the spirit of your question is, yes, if a student does drop out, they can receive ETV support, but some of it depends on how that timing lines up and that they haven't been dropped out or stopped out for too long.
In order to make that determination, I realize that sounds somewhat vague. To make that determination for each individual student and in each individual case, the student will need to contact their ILS. And again, we'll be happy to provide that information. If you have a student that's not sure who their ILS is, we can point them in the right direction and have them contact that person. They're our state specialists who know the ins and outs of these, who can definitely guide them down the right road.
And the Independent Living program has a new website, Georgia Rise. I think if you did a Google search for Georgia ILP RYSE, it will point you there. And there's a listing of each of the independent living specialists by region. So that should be fairly easy to find.
Right. Students must maintain a 2.0 and they must complete renewal applications just to update their address and their information, as well as provide survey information and grades. Again, Lori already spoke towards surveys, but we do provide the incentive of $25 being added to their stipend card, and so we hope that is enough to provide reasons for students to continue to complete those surveys.
Can I jump in with a little of the evaluation stuff? So one of the things that I think we'll talk about in a minute is the online system that we're hoping to go to. But the piece with the grade reports and the stopping out, that's all stuff that we're going to be looking at as an evaluation team, and that was one of the purposes of putting this over at UGA with some researchers. We've got some folks who are working on this with us, but it's going to be really important. Any of those students that do stop out, we're trying to reach out to them with an interview so we can see kind of why they stopped out, what we might have done differently, if it was anything with the funding, just so we can start keeping track of that. And there's really no state right now in the country doing any type of this feedback. This is really exciting for Georgia to be able to do. And so these surveys are part of that. Those stop out interviews will be part of that. And then any of that information that we're collecting with grade reports, with academic progress, all of that's going to be going into this evaluation so we can see what kind of bang for their buck the state is getting by using these funds.
And ultimately, I'll tag on to that, is that if there are opportunities to make changes or provide additional supports or identified services that might be delivered in a different way, that's another sort of companion goal to the evaluation, is what as a state can we be doing, continue doing, or be doing differently to support students transitioning from foster care and in pursuit of a degree. Because, thinking back to that slide about income potential and insurance against unemployment, I mean, those are the outcomes that we're trying to both support and buffer against. So as we look to the future, we started at UGA, we started making our first payments out of the ETV program in July of 2015. So we've been at it just a little more than a year. One of the things that we went into that first year looking to develop was an online system. So everything now is a system that's based on email and fax and snail mail. And so what we're planning, we're very close to being able to launch an online system that will look like if you have a health savings account, it'll be a dashboard-based system where students will be able to log in using their unique login and then track not only their progress, but mostly their funds availability, and then be able to upload some of those required documents through that system using their phone. So our goal with that is to make this a very user-friendly kind of process for both students and then the ILSs who have to confirm eligibility and sign off on payment requests and things like that. So we're working right now. Our goal is to have any payment processed in a very short, timely kind of process, which can be sometimes, our goal is really under 2 weeks, 10 business days. And if we can't make that happen, we're in communication with the university or technical college to help them understand what we're waiting on so that students' schedules aren't getting dropped and that kind of thing. But our hope is that this online system will expedite the process even just a little bit more.
Well, we've experienced over the past years that we have great partners across the state in all of our tech schools and colleges and trade schools, but everybody, as long as we're communicating, which we tend to do very well with those guys, they communicate with us so great. We do get those checks turned around in 5 to 10 business days, but if for any reason we've got a hold waiting on information, those colleges are very understanding and very helpful. So we have just a great team of folks all across our state working to make sure students are cared for in the best possible way. Even with that, we do want to highly encourage folks to plan early. Any student, regardless of care or not, having been in care or not, need to plan early. That's a no-brainer, but especially our students in care and receiving ETV funding or other support. Those pieces of paper that go through and emails that have to be sent and phone calls that have to be made to make sure everything happens seamlessly are so critical to making sure student schedules aren't dropped and housing isn't denied or whatever that may be. So please encourage your students to plan and plan early. As soon as their spring semester, their high school year rolls around, we hope they have a plan in place for what's going to happen throughout that semester and then that following fall as they enter into post-secondary education.
One quick example of I think we all probably understand why, in all aspects of life, it's helpful to plan early. But we have, here at UGA, we have a close relationship with our financial aid office, and consistently we've heard stories from the financial aid office about students who are not submitting their FAFSA until June or July or even August and September once school has already started. And what that doesn't allow the financial aid office folks to do is consider them for institutional scholarships. So we have a number of private donors who are providing scholarship funds for students who have experienced some hardships. It doesn't specifically identify foster care or homelessness, generally speaking, but those students would fall into the category. And so if the financial aid office doesn't know that they're coming, and the FAFSA is the way that they know that they're coming, they can't be considered for those funds. And different universities and technical schools have different opportunities for scholarship support. So every institution looks a little different. But if students are not taking the steps to get those, to meet those deadlines and in fact planning early, they may miss some opportunities. And so it's important to do that.
Yeah.
So last thing, there are a couple of resources here that are that you might find helpful. The first and best resource is your student's independent living specialist. They've been at this longer than we have. They know the ins and outs, generally speaking, and they're the ones who are going to be making eligibility inquiries and approvals and that kind of thing. Here are some of those websites that we pointed out throughout the webinar today. Another one that we didn't really hit on, but is the Embark Georgia. I mentioned it early on. If you go to that website, if you're working with students and you have a student who's considering one of the public universities or technical college schools, this is a great site for them to peruse, to see about what each campus offers specifically in terms of programming for students who have experienced foster care. But also, if you go to the statewide network tab on the Embark site, we have a designated point of contact who's been identified at each campus who is happy to respond to phone calls or inquiries before a student is there, but then also help to troubleshoot once a student gets there. So that's another good site to check out.
Yep. So guys, that is I know that was very quick and in just less than an hour there that we ran through that. That's a lot of information, a lot of ins and outs and policy around how this works. So we just want to hang out for a few minutes and answer any questions you may have. And again, we're going to get your emails. We should have your emails through the webinar system, but if you feel like we may not, you can type it in there under your chat box or your question box, and we will come back to it and grab it and make sure you get emailed this information. So feel free to leave your email, or we'll go back and get it from the GoToMeeting webinar link, and we'll happily answer any questions you have now.
And just feel free to type them in. And the last thing I'll say is, if you do have questions while you're typing, is that our plan is to, we've recorded the webinar today, and we're going to post it on that Embark website. And it'll be probably a couple weeks by the time we get it edited down and able to post. But that will be coming. So if you have friends or colleagues who might feel like they could benefit from the information, you can share that link with them.
And right now on the Embark Georgia page, if you look at the top, there's an ETV bar that you can click, and it'll be posted on that area of the website.
You may have outside of the content of the webinar, and we look forward to seeing you around the state. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.